Now the purpose of these demonstrations, and I'm going to divide it up into three instalments, is to show how we might introduce some liveliness into our watercolours. Liveliness and loose are not very helpful words to use. For instance, there's no such thing as a loose brush or a lively colour that we can buy from the art store. So I want this to be a no-nonsense practical guide about how we can introduce that element into our pictures in a practical way. Now I'm going to base my demonstration on this watercolour which I painted a couple of weeks ago. This particular painting is in a portrait format. I'm going to change the composition a little bit and do a landscape format. Apart from anything else, it fits more easily onto the camera so that you can see more. Now I've already drawn it out, so let's get started. Now the first thing to consider for introducing and making sure that your painting looks as fresh and lively and loose as possible is to consider the composition, and particularly be aware of any accidental coincidences. For instance, you'll see that I've positioned myself and, if necessary, moved some of the forms in the painting so that they overlap. This little dinghy here, for instance, overlaps this larger yacht, but I wanted to make sure that none of the lines coincided with either the line of the water anti-fouling or obviously the curve, so it looks a little bit untidy. I altered the mast so it's a different angle. I didn't want it to replicate and be parallel to any other lines. And this jumble of dinghies needs to be painted as a jumble. In other words, make the painting reflect nature and man and make it look untidy. It's very easy to unconsciously tidy things up and you actually then lose the life. The other thing that's important is to use nice, clean, fresh, guppy paint. A lot of little things contribute to injecting life into a painting. One is obviously the composition and I like boats, so I paint boats amongst many other things. Use rich colour, overlapping shapes, apply the paint in a direct, emphatic, positive way and keep going. And my aim is to get the painting looking as fresh as possible by applying the paint once and living with that, and not to paint anything twice until I've painted everything once. Now it's quite a warm day here, so I'm not sure how quickly the paint is going to dry, so I would like to start somewhere fairly small to begin with, just to see how the paper is going to take the paint. So wet the brush, dip the brush into the paint, load the whole of the brush, and let's make a mark along here. I'll just darken the rear of this, the stern, because the sunlight is coming from the right hand side. Rinse the brush, cobalt and a little bit of light red to give me a bluey grey, and we can then paint the shaded side of this dinghy a little bit darker, so some ultramarine down here. Rinse the brush, give it a little bit of a wipe, and then soften that edge. Some viridian green, raw sienna, some sort of tufty grass here, so let's put the shadow in so that the boat is joined to the ground. Some Payne's grey, not a colour I use a lot, but it's quite useful if you want a dark and a thick dark, just to get the little trolley wheel in here. And there. Now we've made a start, we can now consider, I'll just make other things. Let's just make a little dark of some form here in the background, and that'll just help set the viewer on their way to looking at the shape of that bow. Some raw raw umber and cobalt violet, tiny little bit of cerulean as well, blue. This is quite an old boat, got lots of different sort of stains down the side of here. So paint what you have noticed and what you've seen, and perhaps what other people might actually even leave out. Ultramarine and burnt umber, quite thick paint. And of course I'm taking advantage of the little bit of moisture already on the paper so that they merge. Now some burnt sienna to do the rail along the edge here. Load the brush and keep going. Ultramarine and light red. Let's put in this bluey grey here. And of course when you're painting any form, you're also painting the ones next to it. A little bit of a shadow underneath that, which will gradually diminish. I try and hold the brush as far away from the hair as I can to get, so I paint with my arm rather than my wrist. Now there's lots of stains and things running down this boat into here. Let's put some there of various different colours. Make the boat look a little bit more sort of untidy in the way it's, so it looks a little bit sort of lived in. I'll just dry that edge up there a bit, and virgin and raw umber, quite a thick mixture, because again I'm using the moisture on the paper that's going to help join this up. Let's have just some raw umber now. A lot of bits of green on that water's, on the, it's really where the boat sits in the water. And then burnt sienna. Rich paint applied simply and directly is the key to keeping the painting looking fresh, but also looking loose, and perhaps introducing a little bit of life in it. A little bit of cadmium red to liven that up a bit. If I see a hint of any what you might call naughty colour, a little bit of strong colour, I'm just going to put a bit of a little bit more cobalt violet there. It's thicker paint in a moist area, so it won't have there'll be no problems. It's when you put a very watery mixture into a damp area that you get cauliflowers. Now I've turned to burnt umber, so notice all the time I'm painting every area, I'm thinking let's just change the colour a bit. A little bit more green there. This is very much underneath in the shade. Now we can lighten it a little bit as I'm coming to another area where there'll be darks. And of course here really what I'm doing is I'm painting forcing out the bow and the stern of this little dinghy. Raw sienna and a bit of cadmium yellow, perhaps a bit of cadmium orange as well for this. It's one of the big sort of foam rubber things that the boat sits on. And then burnt umber and burnt sienna to give me the darker bit there. Quite thick paint, so it stays where you are, but it fuses, or it stays where you put it, but it fuses with what you've already put. So it sort of makes what I call makes friends with the rest of the painting. You want it to look as if it belongs to where you've put the picture in. That's going to be a little bit further back there. Come down a bit low on that, so let's just take some of that off. All very close together, these forms. And then finally in this section, let's just put in the light mast here, and spars. I think there's a mast and a boom fastened together there. Now I've just left that to dry. I forgot to say this is simply a piece of Bockingford £200 knot paper. It's a half imperial, 22 inches by 15 inches roughly, and the paint I'm using is just ordinary or the professional quality, artist quality Winsor & Newton. They're all Winsor & Newton colours. Right, well let's move on and do a little bit more of these boats. There's a blue tarpaulin over this cover over this boat here, or dinghy I should say. Straight cobalt. I used to be very nervous about painting with colours straight out of the tube, but that fear has now left me. If I see a nice bright colour, particularly a primary colour, then I go for it. This is add a little bit of light red to give me a grey, which I'll go straight on here to get the underneath of that boat, and then with a damp brush I'll just soften that. Let's just wipe that a bit more so it's soften that edge. But again, don't forget raw umber and Viridian. Don't forget to, quite stiff paint again, because I've got a fair amount of moisture here, to anchor that to the ground with a little bit of a shadow which can be joined on. I'd rather connect the shadow than worry about having the foreground painted first. I can soon glaze over these small shadows. Now there's a ultramarine for this blue canopy here. And then let's have a bit of cerulean, just as it's a little bit lighter here. I'd rather lighten it with a lighter blue than just add water to the ultramarine to lighten it. Water is the hardest thing to control. Now, cadmium orange and a little bit of raw umber. This just put a tiny bit of cadmium red with that. The cabin on this boat was quite a sort of goldy colour. So we'll put that in now. And then while that's drying, go back to this blue. Let's have a little bit of burnt sienna to grey that again. And we can start doing the shaded side of many of these white sort of dinghies. Really quite dark underneath that. So let's get ultramarine and burnt umber to make it slightly darker. Right underneath that. And then Payne's grey almost straight out of the tube, and we can just suggest these wheels here on this trolley. We may as well do this one at the same time. As you can see, it's quite thick paint. I'm delivering this to dry paper, therefore I had to add a little bit of moisture. There was a bit of wet on the paper, which helped the paint flow. But of course, a little bit of dry brush helps sort of indicate some sort of vigour to the mark. A bit of raw umber and a bit more ultramarine with the blue here to give me the sort of slightly more dirty. Let's change it again, slightly more dirty grey. And then of course it'll be quite dark underneath here. Let's make it burnt umber and ultramarine. Start again with a different, let's have some cerulean blue and a little bit of cadmium red, say, a bit too strong, and that'll give me a different type of grey. So if you want, don't mix up one uniform grey and use it everywhere. If you want a different grey, deliberately use a different blue and a different orangey red. I'll just put a bit of cobalt with that to get that, and of course that'll be a shadow under there. And then soften this edge with a damp brush to get a slightly sort of rounded shape. Perhaps I ought to just darken that even a bit more there. Then light red and burnt sienna and raw umber. give me these edges, and this one, ultramarine. Because that's in the shade, and cobalt, perhaps, might, if we're lucky, you get a little bit of, no, we're not going to get it. Thought we might have got a bit of dry brush there, but never mind, to indicate the edge of that boat. And then finally, with a bit of burnt umber, let's see if we can get the edge on this one and that one there. And while that's drying, we might even be able to get a bit of shadowing across there. And finally, put in the dark of that porthole, bit of drawing around that. So we're making progress all of the time, and keep going. And as you can see, hopefully, if you put the colour on nice and strong in one go, it retains a sort of life and freshness. And if you're deliberate and emphatic and positive with the stroke, I think it can tend to look loose, simply because by doing it once as carefully as you can, if you're like me, inevitably you end up with a little bit of a wobble. But that's the character of the artist, and you want that to show through. Now, just one or two little additional marks, ultramarine and cobalt, a little bit of shading here and here, put those on very quickly, and ultramarine to give me this blue, thick blue cover here. That's in the shade. Rinse your brush, cobalt, a lighter blue. Now I've gone from dark to light. It really doesn't matter which way around you do it. Put a little bit of light red with that cobalt to give me a little bit of a shadow under here, all joined on, of course. And then we'll have a diagonal shadow there, which will help from something unseen in the rest of the little diagonal little shadow under there, and perhaps there. Now we just let that dry out. In the next section, we'll have a go at the larger areas, the sky and the foreground, just while we'll just wait for that to dry off.